The day I signed my house over to my children, the notary warned me. She slid the papers across the mahogany desk, clicked her pen once, and looked at me over her reading glasses with the kind of expression doctors reserve for patients who refuse chemotherapy. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "once this transfer is complete, you have no legal claim to this property. None. Are you absolutely certain?" I smiled. I told her I was absolutely certain. That was the second biggest mistake of my life. The first was raising children who would prove me wrong. Daniel Whitmore had built his house with his hands. Not metaphorically, though that was also true. He had laid the foundation stones himself, age 31, hauling gravel in a wheelbarrow under an August sun that punished without mercy. He had framed the walls with his brother-in-law Terence, who drank too much but swung a hammer like God intended. He had shingled the roof on a Saturday in October while his young wife Margaret handed up supplies from the ladder below and called him a fool every third minute, affectionately. That was 1987. The house sat on 2.5 acres in Millhaven, Georgia, a town small enough that everyone knew your business and large enough that they pretended they didn't. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a porch wide enough to hold a family reunion, which it had done many times, a kitchen that smelled perpetually of coffee and wood smoke. A garden that Margaret had tended for 30 years before her knees gave out, and Daniel took it over, learning to love tomatoes the way you learn to love anything late in life, slowly, with surprise. 3 children had grown up in that house. Carla, the eldest, was 51 now. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubbornness, which in Daniel's opinion was the worst possible combination. She lived 40 minutes away in a subdivision where every house looked like it had been photocopied from the same original, and managed a dental practice with terrifying efficiency. She visited on holidays and birthdays, and whenever she wanted something, though Daniel had spent years pretending not to notice the pattern. Marcus was 48, the middle child, the peacemaker, the one who laughed too easily and meant it too rarely. He sold commercial real estate in Atlanta and drove a car that cost more than Daniel had earned in his first 5 years of working. He visited less than Carla but called more, which Daniel supposed was a kind of trade-off. Then there was Elise, 44, the youngest, the one Daniel had always privately considered the most like himself, which was perhaps why their relationship had always carried the particular friction of mirrors facing each other. She was sharp, direct, sometimes unkind in her honesty. She had moved back to Millhaven 3 years ago after a divorce, and it was Elise who had first suggested the arrangement. The arrangement. Daniel's hip had been replaced in 2019, and while the surgery was successful, recovery at 73 was not the same animal as recovery at 50. He moved more slowly. The stairs troubled him on cold mornings. Margaret had passed 4 years prior pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, the kind of speed that doesn't allow for proper grief, only shock followed by a long, quiet unraveling. Alone in the house, Daniel managed. He was not a man who catastrophized his limitations. He cooked, he gardened, he drove himself to doctor's appointments and the hardware store and the Wednesday morning men's group at his church. He watched the news with the sound turned up and read history books and called his grandchildren, who were polite in the way of children who have been coached to be polite. But Carla had decided he was a problem to be solved. She had come one Sunday in March with a folder. An actual folder, the kind with tabbed dividers, as though Daniel were a client rather than her father. Inside were pamphlets for assisted living communities, printouts from a website called seniorlivingoptions.com, and a one-page document she had apparently drafted herself titled, with extraordinary audacity, Transition Plan for Dad. "I'm not transitioning anywhere," Daniel said. He handed the folder back without opening it fully. "I'm having pot roast. You're welcome to stay." "Dad, this house is too big for one person." "It's not too big. I know where everything is. The gutters need replacing, the HVAC. I'm having it serviced Thursday." Carla pressed her lips together. It was the expression she had worn since childhood when her will met an immovable object, and Daniel recognized it the way you recognize an old scar. "We're just worried about you." "I know you are," he said. "I appreciate it. Now are you staying for pot roast or not?" She stayed, but the folder was the first stone of an avalanche. Over the following months, the pressure accumulated the way water damages a wall, not all at once, but persistently, invisibly, until one day you press your hand against the plaster and find it soft. Carla visited more frequently, which might have been touching if each visit didn't include a casual inventory of what wasn't working. The loose step on the porch, the overgrown hedgerow along the south fence, the refrigerator that hummed too loudly, the fact that Daniel sometimes forgot to call back within 24 hours. Marcus called from Atlanta to say, in his reasonable commercial real estate voice, that property values in Millhaven were actually quite strong right now, and that it might be worth thinking about options. He did not specify what options. He didn't need to. Elise, living closest, stopped by unannounced twice in 1 week to find Daniel perfectly fine, once reading on the porch, once pruning the tomato plants, but reported to her siblings that she was concerned about the isolation. They were circling. Daniel saw it. He was old, not blind. What happened next was, in retrospect, a failure of pride. Daniel Whitmore had never asked his children for anything. He had paid for Carla's dental school, co-signed Marcus's first business loan, and sent Elise money during the worst year of her divorce without being asked, and without making her feel small about it. He had given and given, the way parents do when love and money become confused with each other, and the habit of giving had made him believe, wrongly, that he had filled some account that would never run dry. At Thanksgiving, with all 3 children at the table and 4 grandchildren making noise in the living room, Carla made the proposal. She framed it as protection. If Daniel transferred ownership of the house to the 3 of them, equal shares, it would be shielded from estate taxes, from the costs of any future medical care, from the complications of probate. He could live there for the rest of his life, of course. It would be his home. That would never change, but legally, formally. The house would belong to them. It's just paperwork, Marcus said. It's what Mom would have wanted, Elise said, which was the cruelest argument, and Daniel suspected she knew it. He should have said no. He knew it even then, sitting at the head of the table with Margaret's good china and the smell of turkey in the air and his grandchildren's laughter carrying from the next room. He felt something contract in his chest, not his heart exactly, but something adjacent to it. Some instinct that had protected him for 7 decades, trying to send a signal through the noise of family and food, and the accumulated weight of believing the best about the people you love. He said he would think about it. By February he had signed. The education of Daniel Whitmore. The change was not immediate. That was the thing about slow erosions. They flatter you at first with their patience. For several months, everything continued as before. Daniel lived in his house, tended his garden, attended his Wednesday group. The children visited with approximately the same frequency. Nothing seemed different. Then Carla mentioned, in passing, that she'd been thinking about updating the kitchen. The kitchen doesn't need updating, Daniel said. The cabinets are original, Dad. They're 40 years old. They work perfectly. It would increase the property value. He looked at her. I'm not interested in the property value. I live here. She smiled and said she understood, but 3 weeks later a contractor arrived at the door with a clipboard and an appointment that Daniel had not made. He sent the man away. Carla called that evening, her voice carrying that particular tension that passes for patience in people who have none. It escalated in increments so small that each one could be dismissed individually. Marcus began CCing himself on the property tax bills, which required Daniel to explain to the county assessor's office that he was not deceased. Elise, who had a key for emergencies, used it one afternoon while Daniel was at his doctor's appointment and moved several boxes of Margaret's things from the spare room, just to declutter. Dad, you'll thank me, without asking. When Daniel objected, Elise said, with genuine bewilderment, this is our house too, you know. There it was. Our house. Daniel drove to the library that evening and spent 2 hours on a computer, reading about property law, transferable deeds, and the legal rights of occupants versus owners. Then he drove home and sat on the porch Margaret had loved and watched the dark come in over the tree line, and understood with absolute clarity that he had given away the one thing he had built and that he could not get it back. Or could he? The silence before thunder. What his children did not know about Daniel Whitmore, what perhaps they had never known, raised as they were in comfort he had manufactured for them, was that he was not a man who accepted facts simply because they had been presented as permanent. He had rebuilt a transmission at 22 when mechanics told him the car was finished. He had saved his brother-in-law Terence from bankruptcy through a combination of blunt conversation and financial creativity that their accountants still marveled at. He had sat across from a pulmonologist who told him Margaret had 6 months and negotiated nothing because there are things you cannot negotiate, but he had sat there straight-backed and clear-eyed and held her hand for every one of those weeks without once collapsing in front of her because she needed him solid. Daniel did not collapse. He retained a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Oduya, and she was 60, Nigerian-American, and had the unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades ensuring that people who underestimated her regretted it. She listened to Daniel for 40 minutes without interrupting, reviewed the deed transfer documents and said, "The transfer was legal, but your position is not as weak as you think. She explained. He listened. He asked 3 questions, each more specific than the last, and she answered them with the faint smile of a teacher who has found a promising student late in the term. When he left her office, Daniel Whitmore had a plan. It arrived on a Tuesday. Carla found it first. She had taken to stopping by before work, a habit Daniel had stopped questioning. She stood on the porch holding the certified envelope with both hands, reading it twice, her face moving through confusion into something that looked almost like fear. "Dad," her voice was different, quieter. "What is this?" Daniel was in the kitchen. He poured his coffee, walked to the porch door and looked at her through the screen. "It's an eviction notice," he said, "effective 60 days from the date on the letter." "I can see that. I mean, who sent this? Why would—" She stopped. "Read it again." "Dad, this is addressed to us." "To you, Marcus and Elise, yes." The silence that followed had a specific quality Daniel recognized from long ago. From the silence after a car door closes on the wrong finger, that half-second before the pain registers fully. "Dad, you can't evict us. We own this house." "You own the property," Daniel said, opening the screen door and stepping onto the porch. He sat in his chair. Margaret's chair was still beside it. He had never moved it, and held his coffee in both hands the way he did when he was cold, though the morning was warm. "But you don't own my right to occupy it. Ms. O'Dwyer is very clear on that distinction." "Ms. O'Dwyer? My attorney?" Carla stared at him. In 51 years he had watched every emotion cross her face: joy, grief, frustration, love, the particular anguish of being a teenager in a house with rules. What he saw now was something new. "You hired a lawyer against your own children." "I hired a lawyer to clarify my rights," Daniel said. "The deed transfer included an implied life estate in my favor, based on the circumstances under which I signed. Ms. O'Dwyer has filed the appropriate documentation. She has also filed a complaint with the county regarding unauthorized entry to my residence and the removal of personal property without consent." He paused. "That's Margaret's things, Elise. You had no right." Carla sat down on the porch steps. For a long moment she said nothing, and Daniel saw something shift in her, not a performance, not a strategy, but something genuine settling through her like weather. "Dad," she said, "we were trying to help." "I know. We were scared. You're alone in this big house, and every time we came you seemed—" She stopped, and her voice changed. "We didn't handle it right." "No," Daniel agreed, "you didn't. But you could have talked to us. You could have told us you felt pushed out of my own home." He said it gently, but he said it. "You were already treating it like yours. What would talking have done?" Another silence. A cardinal landed on the garden fence and departed. "What do you want?" Carla asked finally. Not the strategic voice, not the dental practice manager, just his daughter, sitting on the porch steps, asking a plain question. "I want the deed transferred back," Daniel said. "I want a formal written agreement about what decisions require my consent. I want Margaret's boxes returned, every single one unopened." He paused. "And I want Sunday dinners back, real ones, not check-ins. I want to see my grandchildren because they want to see their grandfather, not because you've decided I need monitoring." Carla wiped her eyes quickly, the way women who consider crying a vulnerability do it, fast, almost angry. "And if we agree to all that, then Ms. O'Dwyer withdraws the eviction filing, and we spend the weekend fixing that loose porch step together, the way I should have asked you to do 4 months ago." Carla let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. You could have just asked us for help, Dad. You could have just asked me what I needed," he said, "instead of deciding." The deed was transferred back in April, with a properly drafted life estate agreement that Patricia O'Dwyer reviewed with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the value of such documents is entirely in their specificity. Marcus drove up from Atlanta the first Saturday of May, wearing jeans for the first time Daniel had seen in years, and spent 4 hours replacing the south fence posts while Daniel supervised from a lawn chair and offered technical commentary that Marcus accepted with better grace than expected. Elise returned the boxes, all of them, unopened as requested, and sat with Daniel at the kitchen table going through them together, which turned into 3 hours of crying and laughing in proportions that shifted unpredictably and were better for it. Carla fixed the porch step. Sunday dinners resumed. They were loud, imperfect, occasionally tense in the way that families are when they have learned something hard about each other and are still deciding what to do with the knowledge. The grandchildren discovered that their grandfather had opinions about video games, could still beat anyone at cards, and told stories about building this house that grew incrementally more elaborate with each telling. Daniel planted late tomatoes that summer and they came in beautifully. He sat on the porch most evenings as the light fell in his chair, Margaret's chair beside him. He was 78 years old. His hip ached in cold weather. He sometimes forgot names for objects before remembering them. The world moved in ways he didn't always understand, and at speeds he found exhausting. But the house was his. He had built it, he had filled it with people he loved and who loved him imperfectly, which was the only way love had ever actually arrived in his experience. He had given it away once, out of loneliness disguised as generosity, and he had taken it back not out of pride, but out of the deep, plain knowledge that a man's home is not a problem to be managed, not an asset to be optimized, not a transition waiting to happen. It is the place where he is still himself. And Daniel Whitmore, on a warm Georgia evening with the fireflies beginning their quiet work in the garden, was very much still himself. He sipped his coffee. He watched the dark come in over the tree line. He was home,